Alex, thank you for joining me.
Delighted. Good to see you, Brian.
You haven't responded yet to this 5-page letter from the Scientology Church to the Hollywood Reporter. When you read it, I'm sure you've read it by now, what was your reaction?
I found it, frankly, ridiculous. You know, the Hollywood Reporter asked them 20 fact-based, reasoned questions. The church didn't respond to any of them. Instead, they sent a 5-page letter full of nasty invective, character assassinations and innuendo, which is very typical of the church. You know, there's a doctrine in the church called fair game, which means that if there are critics of the church, it's fair game to go after them in any way you can, to slander them, to, you know, put out all sorts of very mean-spirited attacks. And it's interesting to me that a church, which is a religious organization in theory, you know, would spend so much time trying to provoke hatred.
Well, we're showing one of the videos they've produced now. You know, in your film, you talk about the prison camps that the church allegedly has. They then show their administrative offices and say that's the site of the prison camp, the so-called prison camp. How do you explain that sort of contradiction?
Look, we showed in the film, and it's very clearly marked in the film, we showed a photograph of the double-wide trailers that were the whole at the time. It's not there now, but it upsets the church, I'm told, because David Miscavige likes to believe that his facilities are spanking clean and there are no ants. So it was the ants thing that really upset him. But I think the most amusing thing about what they showed in that propaganda video were, one, they showed all the facilities, but there were no people. And I think the membership of Scientology is mysteriously shrinking and shrinking fast. The other thing was that they say, you know, very openly, you can come and take a public tour of these facilities anytime. It's not true.
So I'm sure you tried. What was the response from the church when you tried to gain access?
You know, at the time, I didn't try to gain access to that facility. I wanted to go in and ask some very specific questions of some individuals who particularly related to the story. And the key guy, because many of these decisions come from the top, was David Miscavige. But he has relentlessly refused to talk to me or to anybody. You know, he's the head of the church, but he doesn't speak. And so that's very frustrating. There are a number of other officials we asked for comment too, and they declined.
Asked if they are going to sue you or HBO about the film, they've said, we can't comment, but of course our counsel will consider all options. How hard was it to make this film, keeping in mind all of the legal issues?
It was very hard. We had to be very careful. We're still being very careful, but, you know,
in what ways? How are you being careful?
Well, you know, I think that we were very rigorous in terms of how we checked our story, how we had it scrutinized extensively by lawyers, not only my own lawyers, but by HBO's lawyers. And we hired outside counsel. You know, there was a headline briefly that HBO had hired 160 lawyers. That wasn't true. That was a hyperbolic statement by Sheila Nevins, you know, meant for effect. But it was, as they say in journalism, a fact too good to check. Now, that phrase in and of itself has been put across my chest as if that's something I endorse. I was just remarking on how a number of press outlets around the country ran with that 160 lawyer figure as if it was fact, which it never was.
So there's a lot of lawyers involved, but not that many. And let me also ask you this.
No.
You know, in full disclosure, you're also in business with CNN. Your film about Steve Jobs at CNN Finance actually premiered last night there at South by Southwest. You know, Apple, of course, a secretive company. Is there any comparison between Scientology and any of the other topics that you've ever covered in your films?
Well, I mean, in the case of Apple, we got about the same response to our queries for access from Apple as we did from Scientology, though more amusing in the case of Apple. When we first went in the front door and we went in at the very beginning, they said, sorry, we don't have the resources to deal with your request, which I found interesting for the most valuable company in the history of companies.
I have a feeling, though, they won't be buying Google ads to try to discredit you. Let me finish up with a statement
that's true.
from the
that's
church
true.
and
I
ask
think
you to
that's
comment on it. Here's what it says. It says, Mr. Gibney avoided contacting the church for 2 years. Then he refused to provide the church with questions or allegations to which we could respond. He went on to say, it is apparent that Mr. Gibney was only interested in the story he had preconceived, and any factual information that didn't further his agenda was an inconvenience to him. Tell me what you want them to know as your film prepares to come on television to HBO at the end of the month.
What I want them to know?
Yeah, about your process.
I mean, my process was simple. You know, when I wanted to go to the church and I felt I had, I had some specific questions that I wanted to ask church officials and church members, I went to them and was prepared to interview them and to put them in the film if they had interesting things to say. So I felt I fulfilled my duties as a filmmaker and as a journalist, but they all declined to comment.
Alex, thanks so much for being here and commenting to me.
Thank you, Brian. Pleasure.